Addressing myself today to the Ukraine conflict and President Putin's recent remarks on the Ukraine conflict. So he was at a press conference, I think it was yesterday, when a Russian journalist asked him, "Does the Ukraine conflict resemble genocide?" And he said, "Yeah, it looks like genocide." So what an extraordinary thing to say, and what an outrageous lie. Now, obviously, some civilians have been killed on both sides. But I don't think there's been anything like a massacre on either side, though yes, there was that Malaysia Airlines plane shot down several years ago by pro-Russian forces. But as they're fighting illegally, surely they're terrorists. They're not fighting for a government. The Russian government says they're not our soldiers and they're nothing to do with us, insurgents against the Ukrainian government. But if so, as they're fighting illegally, they can only be terrorists. I mean, if you look at the Terrorism Act in the United Kingdom, it's unlawful violence in any part of the world in furtherance of any national, political, religious, or other ideological cause. And so that perfectly fits it. So Ukraine is a democracy with free and fair elections, though there has been some cheating. That's several years ago, and that's mostly by Putin's pet president, Yanukovych. But if with Putin what he said was true, then should it be a moral obligation for Russia to intervene to save the ethnically Russian minority in Ukraine from genocide? What an outrageous lie. And who in that region really has massacred civilians in recent years? Well, obviously it would have to be Putin himself in Chechnya. At least several thousand civilians deliberately killed in Chechnya. Some fairly large-scale massacres of a few hundred people at a time. I'm not Russophobic in the least. Russians are not bad. I lived in Moscow very happily. The Russians I was very fond of. Is not suggesting that most Russians are bad or that most Ukrainians are good. You find good and bad in every nationality. And so there are other Russians that just be as horrified about this as I am. And that Chechnya conflict, obviously, Putin deliberately started that by carrying out atrocity against his own people in 1999. All those apartment blocks that were blown up, murdering about 200 of his own civilians, a false flag operation, to then blame it on the Chechen separatists. Now, why on earth would they do that when in 1999 they had basically everything they wanted? It's true that Chechen terrorists had deliberately killed Russian civilians on several occasions, and they always bragged about it. They never denied it. This is the only thing they were accused of that they said, no, we didn't do, actually. I mean, there's chapter and verse on those apartment block bombings about how it was explosives from Russian military bases that over the FSB was putting there to murder their own civilians, to create casus belli, to restart that conflict, because Putin thought that make him more popular, and then he'd be elected president next year. Well, that worked. He didn't have total control of the media back then. But anyway, back to 2021. Anyway, if Putin doesn't intervene in Ukraine in a large scale now, that'd be difficult to explain to his people. Obviously, he's been invading it for 8 years now. Well, sorry, not quite, more like 7 years now, that conflict in eastern Ukraine. And who started it? Obviously, Russia started it. And the Russian government lies and lies and lies and tells the most blatant, shameless lies unblushingly every day, so that they're not our soldiers there, when often they're allowed to go and leave and fight there. And there is a plethora of evidence, it's super abundant. You look at all sorts of posts on social media, and the Committee of Russian Soldiers' Mothers talks about this, and some of them are killed and brought back, and it's reported in the local press how they're buried serving soldiers. Some of them are ex-soldiers, and others are Russian civilians who've gone there to fight there. And these are pro-Moscow rebels in eastern Ukraine. Where do they get their weapons from? They're not all Soviet-era weapons. Some of them are post-1991 manufacture. Even the pre-91 weapons, where do they get their ammunition from? They would have run out in all these years of fighting. So they tell this outrageous lie that it's just an internal conflict. If that's what true, why on earth does Russia sign the Minsk Accords? What's it got to do with them? Claiming it's nothing to do with them. Having invaded Crimea, having lied and lied and lied and says it wasn't their soldiers invading, and then bragging that it was their soldiers all along. So there's only government I know in the world will tell such flagrant lies, non-stop, all day, just outrageous, stinking, blatant lies, even when it's utterly stupid. So who on earth would believe that? So Putin said that Russophobia is preparatory to genocide. Well, I mean, there is a bit of Russophobia in Ukraine, and whose fault is that? because of his. I mean, if one country invades another, then the victims of that are not really going to like the other country. There were very good relations till not so long ago. The Ukrainians bent over backwards to accommodate the Russians and be fraternal to them, allowing the Russian Black Sea Fleet to be there, having Russian as a co-official language and all the rest of it. And despite that, and Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons, if Israel was still a nuclear weapons state, this wouldn't be happening. They must be kicking themselves for divesting themselves of nuclear weapons. So anyway, whenever his government is caught doing something shocking, doing something totally illegal and immoral, he'll say it's anti-Russian hysteria. When his government runs a massive doping program with their athletes in the Olympics for years, he says it's Russophobia. It's not anti-Russian to tell the plain truth, and it's obviously desperately unfair. Those clean Russian athletes, the head of their anti-doping program, he fled the country. He gave chapter and verse, explained exactly how the FSB, that's Federalная служба безопасности, the Federal Security Service, organised this whole thing, and they must have been doing it for decades. The East Germans were doping their athletes to help them perform better in the Olympics, and I wonder where the East Germans got that from. Difficult to see. I don't think the Ukrainians will ever get Crimea back, even if Russia becomes a true democracy. Well, it's in the Russian constitution that you can never give away a centimetre of Russian land. Okay, so then that's just not non-negotiable. And so even saying that Crimea does belong to Russia is a crime in Russia. So telling the truth is a crime in Russia. One of the few countries actually criminalizes truth-telling. And why would you have to make that a law? You're obviously not confident. In the United Kingdom, you could say that Northern Ireland doesn't belong to the UK. There's no law against that. I mean, it's wrong, but you would not be in trouble in any way. So people are not allowed to opine. And remember, censorship is against the Russian constitution. The Russian constitution just contradicts itself again and again. You're not allowed to have separatist parties. You know, in the United Kingdom, you can have Sinn Féin, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, separatist parties. They're completely allowed. Obviously, Putin knows a lot of people would want to leave the Russian Federation, and he's managed it so badly that many people want to leave. If nobody wanted to leave, you would allow these political parties. But even Russia hasn't accused the Ukrainian army or anyone else of massacring civilians in the Ukrainian conflict. And over 13,000 people have been killed. And yeah, when you shell a position with enemy soldiers, there might be civilians in that building as well, or that some of these shells go astray. So there are collateral fatalities. The Russian constitution is a footprint book that Putin doesn't even follow. Well, he's blatantly broke it again and again. It was 2 terms of the president. Then he did a job swap, became prime minister, and said, well, they're not 2 consecutive terms. No, 2 means 2. So it's more honoured in the breach than the observance. Hilarious how it's carried in with great reverence at his inauguration ceremony for him to swear that he would uphold the constitution, which he blatantly breaches every single day. So I do feel very sorry for Russians to be deprived of their constitutional rights. He's disentitling them as he's becoming this sort of sawdust Stalin. So on the 8th of December, President Putin restated his view that NATO must never allow Ukraine to join. Ukraine is a sovereign state. Ukraine has the absolute right to form an alliance with any country it wants, just as Russia does. You know, it's got its collective security treaty, this rather moth-eaten version of the Warsaw Pact. It's only got 5 other former Soviet states: Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. So Russia's got about 80% of the manpower, about 90% of the equipment. It's questionable whether this is even a military boon to Russia. Is it more like of a liability, having to equip the Armenians on the cheap and so on, and not really helping them out very much against Azerbaijan? So the United States and other Western countries, they're increasingly perturbed by the possibility of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the Ukrainian army is much better furbished than it was in 2013, when their equipage was often decades behind, and they're up to modern generation weapons. But the one thing that could be guaranteed to forfend a large-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine is the presence of United States troops. But this is one thing that Biden is refusing to do. He shan't dispatch the US military, though there are a few dozen advisors. But perhaps he thinks that Ukraine isn't vital to the United States, and indeed it's not. I think NATO had allowed Ukraine to join in the early 2010s, Putin would never invade it. Yeah, probably. The trouble is it had Yanukovych as president, who was very pro-Moscow. And then NATO might be sharing intelligence with it, which we handed on to them. So about 40% of Ukrainians are ethnically or linguistically Russian. So they, if they cheated enough or made an alliance with one of the other parties, could sometimes win and form the government. But now, because Donbass, Luhansk and Crimea are under the effective control of the Russian Federation, Indeed, they've given out Russian citizenship to all of them. And Crimea is represented in the Russian State Duma. Those who are ethnically and linguistically Ukrainian in the bit of Ukraine that the Ukrainian government actually controls is under 20%, so they're never going to win. Luhansk and Donbass are economically sort of basket cases, and because nobody else will trade for them, that's actually a millstone around Russia's neck economically. Many young people have chosen to leave Donbass and Luhansk. So Crimea used to get a lot of international tourists, it doesn't anymore. So it's a pity. I recognise that most people in Crimea are ethnically, linguistically Russian, would like to be part of the Russian Federation, but that's not the way it works. They don't automatically get that. If you have a border dispute, you refer to the United Nations. You don't get what you want, you have to accept it. He treats the UN as literally irrelevant to this. Anyway, there's this threat of sanctions in the United States if there's a large-scale invasion. But Russia was not put off by that in 2014. They certainly dented their economy, the sanctions, but not so much they ever seem to even considered the retrocession of Luhansk and Donbass, much less Ukraine. He said that he wanted to do a deal or swap, returning Luhansk and Donbass in return for long-term recognition of Crimea. The question is, should we care? Ukraine is a faraway country of which we know little, to echo Neville Chamberlain. But the other argument is if we let's get with that, he'll invade more and more and more. Putin's already illegally occupying part of Moldova for 30 years, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which both belong to Georgia, and claiming that the Georgians would attack him. A country of 3 million people is not going to start a war against a country of 145 million, which has nuclear weapons. So, and it's all moronic from a Russian point of view. It's completely imbecilic. The vastest country in the world doesn't need more land. There are many real problems they have to solve. It's megalomania. So the largest country in the world is not enough to deal with Putin's small man syndrome. So he's got to have more and more and more and more land, rather than tackling actual problems. So Putin and Biden met thrice since Biden was inaugurated on the 20th of January this year. They had a virtual meeting via Zoom not long ago. It's thought that there are 100,000 Russian troops massed on Ukraine's eastern border. That's besides the ones who are already illegally in Luhansk, Donbass, and indeed Crimea. So US sources fear that this could increase to 150,000 in the early 2022. And this is not part of any scheduled military drill. Russia usually informs NATO when they're going to have large-scale exercises, and NATO usually returns the compliment. But if Russia were to invade, it might be in a deniable way at first, sending yet more volunteers into Luhansk and Donbass, 1,000 and 5,000 and 10,000, more and more and more. And they would deny, lie and lie and lie and tell outrageous, idiotic lies until it was too late and taken most of Ukraine. But the Ukrainian army is much bigger, much better equipped, more disciplined than it was several years ago. So is it worth it? I think he probably doesn't want Ukraine as such, but Putin's been very open about it. He regards the implosion of the Soviet Union as the geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, as he said, when perhaps its creation was actually in all the wars and all the oppression started. Not that it was the only oppressive force, and it had some magnificent achievements. Is mainly responsible for winning the Second World War, something people don't particularly want to recognise in the West. Partly responsible for helping the Third Reich by being its ally, invading Poland in 1939, by providing so much succour to them in 1939, 1940, up to the 22nd of June 1941, being their arsenal, being their breadbasket, trading with them so much. In providing a naval base, Basis Nord, to the German Kriegsmarine in the very north of Russia, near Arkhangelsk. So anyway, President Zelensky of the Ukraine, he's been assured of US support, and there's no way they could prosecute this war, afford it, or have the weapons if they weren't provided with this by the United States. Presumably the CIA and spy satellites are telling them exactly what's going on, so they're well apprised of all sorts of things. So he prefer the presence of American troops to solely receiving armaments. So Moscow complains vituperatively that she was promised by the United States in 1991 that NATO wouldn't move 1 inch to the east. However, that's not part of any treaty or any formal agreement. Supposedly, it was a throwaway line in one meeting. So that's not legally binding at all. And why do these countries wish to join NATO? Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, because they were Poland, Romania, because they were invaded and horrifically oppressed by the Soviet Union and previously by Tsarist Russia. So finally they have a functioning democracy. And despite many of them having really no precious natural resources, wealthier than Russia, because they got courts that people trust, and they've got the contracts are actually upheld, and all the rest of it. And their education is not just like force feeding people hyper nationalistic, militaristic propaganda. So I mean, Putin, he calls Ukrainians fascists for defending their democracy. Only about 2% of Ukrainians vote for the so-called fascist parties. I mean, Russia's got its own fascist party, ironically named the Liberal Democratic Party. And what would be the hallmarks of fascism? This cult of the personality, rigged elections, censoring the media, hyper-nationalism, militarism, anti-feminism, homophobia, really privileging the major religion, wars of aggression, the big lie, and on and on and on. I mean, obviously, Putin ticks all the boxes. I was quite ironic teaching history there and pointing out how Hitler made himself both president and prime minister, chancellor, at the same time. And I didn't dare point out that Putin had done exactly the same thing for a brief while. So, I mean, I'm not saying that Putin is Hitler. No, he's like only about 1% as bad as him. But his troops definitely have committed fairly large-scale massacres in Chechnya. They're not in recent years, and got off scot-free and never been prosecuted about it. They've been promoted instead. So Russia says that Ukraine has persistently failed to implement the Minsk Accords, and Ukraine says that Russia's failed to honour these terms. Anyway, so US sanctions would almost certainly include cutting off SWIFT, this international payment system. Now, Russia's been developing its own alternative, but it's dubious that this would work anything like as well. But I think Putin is willing to sacrifice his people. There's been a lot of suffering. There's been wage compression, and real terms, income's been going down for several years. Inflation is galloping, but he doesn't care a thing about ordinary people. He'll spend huge sums on armament, starting completely unnecessary wars of conquest, and that's what matters to him, not the common weal. The welfare of his people he doesn't care about at all. So he's no Marxist-Leninist in the economic terms. That was cataclysmic, even he can see that. But he looks back to the days of a one-party state, of the reign of terror. He's openly admiring of Stalin, and that should tell us all you need to know about him. He extols one of the cruelest mass murderers of all time. And it's terrifying that so many Russians have got a very positive image of this man who slaughtered so many of their people. And when some Ukrainians did turn towards fascism when the Germans came, it's partly because they thought, well, it can't be as bad as communism, when millions of Ukrainians, Kazakhs, and even Russians were deliberately starved to death by these madcap policies. I mean, Putin saying Russia won the Second World War. Well, if the Soviets won it, and Russia's only 50% of that, the Ukrainians suffered proportionally more casualties than the Russians. So did the Belarusians. And whilst it's true that some Ukrainians joined the German side, so did some Russians. You will have heard of Andrei Vlasov. Anyway, so we know that Putin, he's all for follow the crowd, be a sycophant, be a conformist. So I know what he would have done if he's in the Third Reich. And he's certainly extremely intolerant of even peaceful dissidents in Russia, even exercising their constitutional rights. So the unconstitutionality of his rule is scandalous. So if there was an invasion, they said that Nord Stream 2, that pipeline out of the Baltic Sea, providing gas from Russia to Germany, would never be permitted to function. The German authorities are still trying to certify it as safe for usage. But Moscow might think this is bluff, that the Germans can't survive without that gas. France has vowed that they would take harsh measures against the Russian Federation were this to occur. But Russia might think they can cope with this, and the Europeans won't do that much. I mean, Europe has been pathetically weak. They could have cut off all trade with Russia. What would they do with hydrocarbons? There are other hydrocarbons. If the EU is to survive without Nord Stream gas, well, they can buy more American gas or biomass. The Americans not willing to sell it particularly cheap. So 7 years of Western sanctions, they've definitely hurt the Russian economy. These completely avoidable wars that Putin had started, his wars of aggression, they have cost the Russian economy hundreds of millions of dollars. But the country, they've got smarter at minimizing the impact of these sanctions. But as I say, the economic loss has never been enough to make Russia even mull cutting off support for these pro-Moscow terrorists in eastern Ukraine, or indeed handing back the illegally occupied territory. So over 13,000 people have been killed since 2014. It's slowed down considerably. There's a theory that this big build-up of forces is just a training exercises that they did several months ago, or it's a warning, it's to threaten Ukraine not to try and take back its stolen sovereign territory, which might be the case, because I suppose the Ukrainian army is strong enough to do that in Luhansk and Donbass, but they're chary about upping the ante. and they're not sure that they'll be back to the hilt by NATO. If Ukraine was in NATO, then all NATO countries would be obliged to go to war. I mean, I can see why Biden doesn't want to take on extra commitments after Afghanistan. It was a bit like a Vietnam syndrome. And, this could lead to a third world war. This could lead to a nuclear exchange. This could lead to the annihilation of the human race. And I'm afraid sacrificing Ukraine is a far better option than wiping out our species. So, what do you think? Send me your answers on the postcard. Please subscribe. I desperately need donations to keep this channel going. So please subscribe on PayPal. Donate to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. That's GeorgeCallahan79@gmail.com. So I do online lessons in history, politics, elocution, public speaking, debating, religious studies, citizenship, French, English as a foreign language, the life in the UK test if you want British citizenship. I'm a tour guide in Londinium. All right, toodaloo.